Hello. So welcome. Hopefully I'm speaking to you, a new employee at Butte County Office of Education, and I want to say welcome. And my name is Sandra Azevedo, and I am a coordinator of continuous improvement with the Coordinated District Support Team. And there's going to be lots of acronyms and lots of different departments. So hopefully it won't take too long before you're oriented. I've been with Butte County Office of Education for about 18 years. I started as a school psychologist and worked in the special education department for many years, supporting some of the programs there. And about 4 years ago, I shifted out of special education over to the Coordinated District Support Team and started doing some trainings for multi-tiered systems of support. Multi-tiered system of support is technically what we call it, and that's MTSS is the acronym. And I also do work for districts around continuous improvement. I've had a leadership network, do restorative practices, and social emotional learning. And so sometimes you'll hear me say SEL for social emotional learning, which is what we're going to talk about today, and RP for restorative practices. So because I have no idea what your background is or what you do, I will do my best to explain enough so that you understand, but not too much because you probably have a great deal of expertise. So I am going to do some screen sharing here. We'll see how that goes. I'm pulling up a slide deck from a previous social emotional learning community of practice that we've done. And I'm just going to highlight some of the key elements about what social emotional learning is, about how it fits into a multi-tiered system of support, and just try to provide some context about that while we get started. Okay. So let me put this into present mode and we'll see what happens. Okay, SEL and MTSS. So I just did an introduction about that. So a couple things that I want to highlight is that in California, we had this big initiative a couple of years ago called the California Multi-Tiered System of Support Initiative. And it was a little bit different than some general trainings about what MTSS is. And I would say the most important thing to know about that is that really took a systemic approach to multi-tiered system of support. So how are we organizing all of our people, all of our resources? How are we arranging our schedule? How are we thinking about our leadership? How are we creating a vision for this work? How are we tapping into our why so that we can be able to provide a full continuum of supports for students in terms of their academic needs, their behavioral needs, and their social emotional needs. So what we realized here in California was that in order to be able to truly provide supports for all students across all of those domains, it would require a reorganization of our schools as they currently function. And so there's a framework that is included in the California MTSS work that helps us move through that process, helps schools capitalize on their strengths and slowly work towards systems that help us get there. And it includes things like, how are we engaging our families and communities? What are our policies and practices? Do they align with this work? So this training isn't about MTSS per se, but I wanted to put some understanding to that. And I will try to continue to do that through this training to help you understand how social emotional learning fits within that. So here's the graphic that we used for the California MTSS initiative. And as you can see, there's the academic, behavior, and social emotional circles over there on the right. And in the middle, it highlights the whole child. So that's really our goal here. And you may hear conversation around the whole child approach. And that is what this is referencing. There's also a slogan underneath it that says all means all. And that is a really important one that calls out that this really means all students, even those students. It's really designed for even students with severe disabilities or other needs to be included as much as possible and part of the traditional school community. And again, that requires a different frame for thinking about equity and different ways that schools will utilize their resources and organize around that. So then it has the 4 people, and you can see at the bottom there's the family and community engagement pillar, administrative leadership pillar, integrated education framework pillar, and then the inclusive policy and practice pillar. And then the umbrella represents that continuum of support for those 3 areas I mentioned. Okay. So this is where it breaks down more clearly how academic instruction can be looked at, how inclusive behavior instruction can be considered, and how inclusive social-emotional instruction is considered. So this is that continuum of support, and we're going to be talking today about the inclusive social-emotional instruction component. So if we're thinking systemically, we want to look at things like assessment, using teams, providing social-emotional supports for all students. How are we going to provide supplemental interventions and supports for students who need more? And overall, how are we going to provide comprehensive social-emotional development assessments across the full range of need? And so even though these 3 things are listed separately, the idea is, of course, that they're layered. And when we support students, we know that students don't just come to the table with behavior needs or social-emotional needs, that typically we need to look at the child as a whole and how are those things interfacing. If the student is struggling with academics, are we considering if they have any behavioral or social-emotional learning needs that are contributing to that academic challenge? And conversely, if the student is having behavior challenges, are we looking at their academics, for example, or their social-emotional capacities? So even though they're here separately, when we come to the tables and have those conversations, all of that data and learning is meant to be brought into that space together when we're deciding what support students most need. So here's the continuum of support graphic, and at the top it says for all students we are providing universal support. And this is a really important component, and especially for social-emotional learning, we haven't always done that universally. So this is saying, how are we ensuring that every student in our school is getting a foundational support for social-emotional learning? Not just, oh, these kids need some extra support because they're struggling with friendship skills, so we're going to provide them a group. It's saying, no, we recognize that social-emotional learning is critical for all students, and how are we going to build it in to our day and our school and our programming so that all students get foundational social-emotional learning support. Supplemental support, so that says, well, if some students aren't getting everything that they need in that universal base and they need more, how are we designing our systems so that we can provide a higher level of support for those students? It doesn't have to be a different intervention. It could be that we are just providing a time where we're providing extra teaching around that concept, either in a small group or individual, or somehow just increasing the frequency or intensity of that learning. And then the top level of support, sometimes called tier 3, is intensified support. And so that's those students that, you know, need even more support. So how are we designing systems where we're ready to be able to respond to those students' needs and provide a more intense social-emotional learning supports if that is warranted? So one of the things that's important in our county is that we encourage people not to use language that says, this is a tier 2 kid or this is a tier 3 kid. What we like to say is that, kids aren't in tiers, interventions are. So that's just one of the things that I want to call out. And I caught myself doing it. It's pretty common, and that's okay, but it is important to try to catch our language and use language that shows that kids are not in tiers. Certainly they can move in and out of all of these in different as their needs change, but our interventions and supports are in tiers. Okay, so I'm going to skip those things. All right. Okay, so here's the definition of social emotional learning, and this comes from CASEL. You can see the little graphic at the bottom of the right part of the screen, and that is the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning. And CASEL is a premier nonprofit that really is a go-to for all things social emotional learning. Their website, casel.org, has oh my gosh, almost every resource you can imagine. Really powerful stuff. So we use their framework here in California. There are other frameworks for social emotional learning, but theirs is the one that we use the most here in California. So here's their definition. Social and emotional learning is the process through which children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. So it's a process, it's not a program. It's a lifelong adaptive process, and it's really importantly is for adults and students. And we never have this all figured out. It is something that we continue to do. So I want to mention here too, there's this concept that is, or a new expanded definition that you may hear more about that is called transformative SEL. And what is happening with transformative SEL is this expansion to include more social justice elements, things, thinking around our own biases, thinking about the ways that we come together with our community to solve complex problems. And so I think there's going to be more and more discussion about transformative SEL. And if that interests you, you might look that up, because it's with the infusion of equity and social emotional learning. I think it's a really helpful framing for us to think about how these competencies apply in that social justice realm. Okay, and so now we're diving down from that bigger picture to what is social emotional learning. I just read the definition to you, and here is one of the most frequent graphics you will see, and we reference it as the CASEL wheel. And what it highlights are these 5 domains in the middle, and you can see the orange ones are about the self, self-awareness and self-management. The green ones highlight others, like more externally facing competencies, social awareness and relationship skills. And then the yellow one is responsible decision making. And so these 5 competencies are ones that we want all students and adults to learn. And again, there's something we're always working on. Like I might just discover, at my mature age, self-awareness about something that I hadn't previously been aware of. And so this really highlights adults and students. So then there's the blue circles surrounding those competencies. We see classrooms, schools, homes, and communities. And what that is illustrating is that social emotional learning doesn't happen in one place for 20 minutes in this classroom, that it happens throughout our lives. It happens in classrooms, it happens throughout our schools, it happens in our homes, and it happens in our community. Okay, and this just highlights in more detail what kinds of targeted skills are under those different areas. And so, for example, under self-awareness, we look at things like how are we identifying our emotions? What is our self-perception and identity? Can we recognize our strengths? Do we have a strong sense of self and confidence? And what about our self-efficacy? Do we feel like we have agency? And then social awareness. Are we able to take the perspective of others? Do we have empathy? Are we able to appreciate diversity? And do we respect others? That domain is really big with some of those social justice conversations that I talked about earlier. Then relationship skills. Are we able to work cooperatively with our peers and with adults in our lives? Are we able to resolve conflicts in healthy ways? And do we know how to ask for help when we need it? And then self-management. There's a lot of overlap here with compliance and some of the behavioral supports. You might hear about PBIS, or positive behavioral interventions and supports. And there's some overlap here because self-management is often a big focus in school because we know that when kids aren't able to self-manage well, their behavior can be challenging and disruptive. So that pie of self-management helps us with impulse control, stress management, self-discipline, self-motivation, perseverance, goal setting, and organization. And then responsible decision-making kind of wraps all those together and says, using all of these other things, how are we doing with identifying problems, analyzing situations, solving problems, evaluating, reflecting, and what are our ethical responsibilities? And then communication popped up over there. Social engagement and building relationships. I think those are part of, the other part of relationship skills: communication, social engagement, and building relationships. Okay. So this lists out what are our state, county, district, and school initiatives. And I just mentioned some of them. The LCAP, MTSS, PBIS, restorative practices, there is a lot. And we get what's called initiative overload. And one of the things that the California MTSS project really did was help us think about what are the ways in which we are mapping all of our interventions and prioritizing them so that we're not overwhelmed and that we have the capacity to do them. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute. And I'm going to talk about some of the different ways that we can infuse social emotional learning into our schools. And the first one I'm going to talk about is explicit social emotional learning. And I'm going to talk about that first because it tends to be the most common. So that is where we use programs such as Second Step or Toolbox. There's a number of programs, and we explicitly teach those to students. Like there's a lesson, we put it in we do it X amount of times a week for this long, and we're intentional, and there's a scope and sequence for how we're rolling out explicit social emotional learning. This is really great for that universal approach where we're making sure that all students have foundational training in a certain amount of social emotional learning skills. So that's one approach. Another approach I want to mention is integration of SEL. And there's a couple different ways to do that. So one way that we can integrate social emotional learning is by utilizing it in academic content. So for example, If you are teaching a literacy or an ELA, section, and you are asking the students about the characters, you can tap into social emotional learning skills of perspective taking and empathy to inquire using questions like, how do you think the character felt when this happened? What do you think will happen next? And, so that's an example of a way to integrate it into what is already happening. Another way to do that is to think about the good teaching strategies and the good social strategies that you already use to intentionally infuse opportunities for students to practice social emotional learning and to experience it. So some examples of that might be, are you setting up opportunities for students to collaborate with one another during class? Because when students collaborate with one another, they're learning and practicing their relationship skills and their problem solving. So that's an example. Another thing is like, how are you infusing warmth and support into that space? When we create conditions that make students feel safe, it can help foster social emotional learning. So another approach is modeling. And that is, how are we bringing ourselves in and how are we using our language to help students experience social emotional learning? And we can do that by being self-aware. We can do that by being socially aware and having healthy relationship skills and good self-management ourselves. We can also speak it out loud and call it out when we're using it so that students can learn our thinking behind those things. I can hear you say, oh my gosh, last night I was really hungry and I ate 3 bowls of ice cream and now I'm feeling guilty. And so tonight I'm going to go for a long walk. So you can then highlight different parts of that you're talking about your own self-management, you're talking about a strategy you're going to use to help you have healthier self-management, and you're naming your emotions and you're showing vulnerability. All of those things are natural things that you would do, but that's how they tie in to social emotional learning. You're really modeling for those students all of those great skills. Okay, I'm going to take a pause right here and I will come back soon.